Okay, and that is a cue. Want to say good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time you're tuning in the program here at allpointstv.com. We are the program called What's Going On, and we come on at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we stay around for another hour. Hope you'll stay tuned with us, and hope you'll enjoy the program. I want to thank some people before we get started today. I want to thank John Wilson, who does so many things here at the studio. He does our sound, make sure the sound is up to speed, and then the lighting and all of that goes on with the program. We need to thank people that are making it happen. We stand here before the camera, or sit here before the camera, and you might think that we are the subtotal of everything that happens at the studio. There are a lot of technicians here to make this program possible. And I want you to stay tuned to all the programs here at allpointstv.com, because a lot of energy goes into it, and we have to make sure we acknowledge the persons that are behind the scenes, because we could not do this program without the efforts of a lot of people that are standing on the sidelines. But if they're not there doing their job, we can't do our job here. So I want to thank all of them, and to give them a certain amount of appreciation for what they're doing.
You got just the one book, so I guess we can tell you what's going on today, right?
Yeah, right.
Concentrating on that little book. All right.
Yeah, I wanted, because I want to remind myself. You're right, John is right about that. I did bring a single book. I brought the Constitution. By the way, the Hillsdale, John, this is the Hillsdale version of it.
Pretty good.
Yeah, because it's in large print, and I appreciate the large print given my bad eyesight. So This is, Hillsdale gives these out, the Constitution's out free, because they're trying to make sure that we are the informed society that our framers were depending upon. They were the mindset that you cannot really maintain a democracy or a republic, not a democracy. We're not a democracy, we're a republic. And they understood that you need to have an informed electorate if the system they put in place is going to be sustained over time. You have to have a constituency that is informed, and they have to be informed about what are the particulars through which we are to be governed, and that is in our Constitution, and to a large extent it is also in Declaration of Independence, in terms of what is found there about why we set government up in the first place. And you have to be aware of the particulars so you can know where the guidelines are. And when those lines are being crossed, we have to hold the persons that are running the country to account. And we're not doing, let's be honest about this, we're not doing a very good job of it at this point, because the lines of demarcation between what they ought to be doing and what is ascribed to their behavior in the document that governs the country, those are not, the two twains don't meet. And there's no congruency between the two. I've said in a couple of my posts on Facebook, for example, that 3/4 of what the government is doing right now in Washington is not delegated to the federal government. And they're doing things now that have crossed the line, and we've got to get them back under the control and auspices of the Constitution of the United States, where we can indeed become again a government of the people, by the people, for the people, or a government of law and not a government of men. We're not that right now. And that's a goal we got to set for ourselves as we go forward, particularly in the upcoming election, November the 3rd of this year, when we have probably the second most crucial election in this country's history. The only one I think that will trumpet, no pun intended, would be the election that was held in 1800, because then the question became, how will an incumbent president respond to a vote that turns him out of power? Because you don't turn kings out of power. And since we are now experimenting with something different, how would, in this case, John Adams, who was president, the second president of the United States, how would he respond to being in power, following the kings whose power was perennial and unchecked, as far as how do you throw them out of power? the only way you can throw them out of power is cut their heads off, which happened in 1649 with Charles I, and then with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, where that would have occurred during the French Revolution in the latter part of the 1780s. So, this it was a question mark. And Adams stepped down once the vote taken multiple times in 1800, and then it was a matter of the House of Representatives getting involved in it, and over multiple balloting that occurred, Adams had to bend to the will of the House of Representatives, and did, in fact, once the die was cast, it was very clear he was not going to be reelected, through the electoral process set in place by the framers, who were intuitive enough to have multiple ways of dealing with anything that went to the level of a bottleneck between the candidates, where the constituents who were not making a decisive verdict, there was a backup plan. It's just really another part of the document they created, which shows how incisive those persons were in Philadelphia, and what kind of a collective mindset was there as they began to create something very new that the world had never seen before. I mean, a constitution followed by the rulers. I mean, even if you put a constitution in front of the rulers, they still don't follow it, but at least you had a document that gives us a guideline of what they ought to be doing. We can certainly hold them account based upon what the document says and what the actions are. So we do have that, and we have to continue to refine our understanding of it. And that's something that Hillsdale College wants to help ensure the country's particulars against them going out of control, and we don't even know that they're out of control because we don't know what the document calls for.
Hillsdale
is one of those colleges that's doing a great job along that line.
Yeah, it's got a very interesting history, because it started back in the 1800s. I forget what exact year, but I think it was started actually to educate blacks and women.
Yeah.
So I mean, and it's kind of the beacon of the ideas that this country's supposed to be. But it's like now it's the liberals kind of dismiss it and scoff it, because it actually was on board for all the stuff the leftists says they're advocating for. Now, they were actually 100 and some years before it was popular, before it was cool. The Republicans are doing it. I mean,
one thing John, one thing I respect about Hillsdale is their determination to maintain their independence. And the way they do that is they do not rely upon the federal government for any of the funding, not even through the student loans and so on, because once they get a shoe inside the door through the funding streams of these universities, then some of that then comes with certain control of the federal government. And what they do is refuse all aspects of federal funding so they can maintain the independence. And that's why they rely upon so many people of goodwill, and people that have goodwill toward Hillsdale, because they understand the value of that institution that exceptionally stands out among all of the others of their peers. And they don't have any peers in terms of their constitutionality that they stand for, because they are the only university that I know of, and I have looked at a lot of the websites of these universities. They are the only one that has online courses, free online courses, where the Constitution is taught. And they should teach it to some of those persons over there at Harvard University, such as Lawrence Tribe and Noah Feldman. Maybe they could take a course in the Constitution, these constitutional scholars, because some of the things they're saying out there shows that there's a lack of their scholarship in that realm. But I give a shout out to Hillsdale College, because they're doing a great job, and they're trying to do what Franklin said would be a problem if we did not pay homage to the particulars, and that was Franklin saying to the woman that questioned him, "What are you all doing in that room?" And he said, "We are creating a republic if you can keep it," because it's been very hard to keep republics. And history is very clear about that. All the republics that were there in the past, they all went by the way of the wind. The way of the wind. And you can read, there's a very good book out about it, written by the French writer in the 1790s. The book written by Constantine Francis Vonnet called The Ruins of Empire. And there's a very, I think it's on page, let me see if I can think of the page number of Vonnet's book. I know it's in the first chapter, but what Vonnet was doing is he was talking to his alter ego. He calls the alter ego the genius, but he's really talking to himself. And he's asking himself, that internal part of yourself where you are the analytical part of yourself, where he's asking these ruins of empire. He's saying, oh genius, what happened to these empires? He's talking about all those empires that existed at that in the past, ancient past, and more modern parts of the past. What happened to them? Because they all went the same way. And the interrogation was, these were once great, laudatory, established empires, and every last one of them came to dust, entered into the dustbins of history. And the question was, why did that happen? So Franklin, aware of that, was saying to the lady that inquired, what are y'all doing in that room? His answer was, we are creating a republic in the face of other republics that have been created. And that's why he added the caveat, a republic if you can keep it, because the others are gone by the wayside. And he was saying that in the case what they were putting in place there was something to try to prevent the Republic of the United States going in that same direction and eventually burning itself out. And that possibility is still here, because every generation has to be the guardians of it. Because as Derek Bell said in his book, Voices at the Bottom of the Well, and we are not saved. Every generation has a responsibility to take that bull by the horn and carry it further down the road and save it for the next generation. And that's our charge right now. I'm going to see how well we do on it, because we are being challenged to do something about it in November. And the die has been cast and the lines are clearly drawn, and we'll see how well we do, because we've got to take the bull by the horn, and we have got to exercise the ballot as a way of saving the republic, because we can do it through the ballot. The ballot used responsibly, and so on and so forth. Okay, it's going to take some work, and we got to stay diligent and do our job. We have a job to do. Okay, let me start off by talking about what happened in Baghdad this past week. And I am going to get to this question about the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sitting in the, if they ever decide to bring to trial the impeachment of President. The president has been impeached. So this idea, has he been impeached? He has not been impeached. He's in limbo impeachment. We don't know if he's been impeached. We can deny the impeachment. The president has been impeached. And when Donald Trump is finally referred to the Senate for the trial, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will be sitting there, and I'll explain before we get off the air today. I'll make it a point to state why he's sitting there, because he's not sitting there as a referee. He's not there refereeing, making sure they're sitting over the process and that they are, in fact, doing their due diligence over a process. It's outlandish for them to claim that he's sitting there as a referee, as a matter of fact, because it says in the Constitution, I guess you go back and read it, Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6, where it says that the Senate, it does not mention the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It says the Senate shall have the sole power to try impeachment. Sole power, we're not talking about S-O-U-L, sole power. Not talking about that power. That's S-O-U-L. I'm talking about sole power, meaning the singularity agency that's involved in it is the Senate. The Senate has the sole power to try impeachment. Nancy Pelosi does not have the sole power to do that. And she didn't really have the sole power to bring about the impeachment charge, which is in the House of Representatives, because that is in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, and it says that the House shall choose its Speaker, and it shall have the sole power of impeachment. The trial, though, the sole power of the trial is in the Senate. One in Article 1, Section 2, and one in Article 1, Section 3 is found there because the House is set up in Article 1, Section 2, and the Senate is set up and established in Article 1, Section 3. See, the Constitution, I keep saying this over and over again, and I cannot say it enough, and validate how important it is to understand it, is that the Constitution is a document that is thematically written, and one phase of it lays over into the following parts of it. And you can see that in Article 1, for example, where in Article 1 it sets up the legislative branch of government and assigns it those duties when it meets and things of that sort. And then in Article 1, Section 2, after you set the legislative branch of government up, then it talks about the particulars of the framing of the legislative body. So Article 1, the second section of it sets up the legislative branch. Why? Why that body before the Senate? Because that's the body that is set up on behalf of the people. And then, who are the people? The people are the states. The states are made up of people. So therefore, it sets up then the senatorial aspect, where they are the states' representatives, but intended as such, until these persons tried to come behind the framers and acted like they knew better than the framers, and what they did was mess it up because they didn't understand the document that they were in fact shaking. And when they shook it in 1913 with the 17th Amendment, you have to understand, if this thing is thematically written and every part lays over into the other part of it, anytime you change it, fundamentally change it, then it's like a spider's web. It all lays over into the other part. So it's like a spider's web. You shake any part of that web, the entire web shakes. And that shook the Constitution, the document, down to the foundation of it, because there was an intentionality behind why you in fact placed the removal power in the Senate and not in the House, because the House represents the people, and then the people, the whole people, not the districts of the states, but the whole people would be the whole state. So that you up the ante then in the Senate. So after establishing the House in Article 1, Section 2, you then set the Senate up in Article 1, Section 3, and the intention there is to have the whole state to be represented. And that's why the Electoral College was placed as a voting block of the states. If you understand the way it's set up, you really have an appreciation of it, but we don't have a lot of people that understand it. I don't think anybody in Washington understands it. I don't have any evidence that, I don't think they even read it, or have read it, or intend to read it. because they're not. If you're not going to follow it, why would you read it in the first place if you're not going to follow it? And they don't follow it, and I don't think they're interested in doing so. But the states were set up as a collective check. See, the check and balance system is everywhere in the Constitution, and the states are to come behind the people. And since it's the total body of the states, the people in each of the districts, but also the total body of the states, it then stands there as a regulator, a bag-up regulator of the people on the state level. It's still representing the people, but the collective is the people collectively, and not by, in this state here, the 14 districts we have in Michigan, we have 14 districts, because you carve the states up into singletary units, and we have 14 now based on the loss of population. So collectively, the 14 units, the whole equal to the sum of its parts, but the parts are 14 in number, but then collectively the parts are coagulated at the state level, and so the state body then makes the decision in the Electoral College. After the digits of the state have made a decision in terms of going to the poll individually and voting for the president, but there's another way of choosing the president where you don't have a single majority that's involved in doing it. What you have in the state's assessment of the president is you have each of the majorities of the states deciding upon the president. And that's because of the fear of single majorities, and you can see how dangerous it is. Look what they did to the president in a single majority in the House of Representatives. But that's all right because they have a backup plan in the Senate. And I hear these politicians. I'll tell you something. These are some really misinformed rulers of the country. And they need to be restrained because they don't even understand the document. You hear them talking about you hear Charles Schumer saying the president and Mitch McConnell are collaborating with each other, and they are doing collaboration, and that's not what's intended by the Constitution. It is intended by the Constitution. There is a political process in the House, and the politicians, that's who they are in the Senate as well. They're politicians in both bodies, and the politicians in the Senate have their say about it, but because it's a political process, the ante has gone up from a majority vote to a 2/3 vote. And there's only two instances that I can think of, and I think there's only two instances in the Constitution where a 2/3 majority is required for passage of some act on the part of the government, and that is in the case of the removal of the president, which takes place in the Senate, so therefore a 2/3 vote there, where it was a single majority in the House. You up the ante in the Senate because the responsibilities are different, but the political process is still in place in both bodies, but you up the ante because of the severity of the consequence of the action. So 2/3 vote is now mandated in the Senate. And the only other place where a 2/3 vote is required in this case in the Senate is the ratification of the treaties of the United States, and that was to have 2/3 of the states to ratify it. And I must say this point, because I don't think anybody has said this. Let me make this point. If the framers had adopted George Mason's point of view, I don't think we would have had a war between the states. Because what George Mason was advocating was that the Constitution should have two things in it that it did not contain when the Constitution was in fact ratified in 1788. It was drawn up in 1787, but it was ratified the following year with the required 9 states of the 13 states. It did not have in it. George Mason had asked for a Bill of Rights. It didn't contain the 10 Amendments. Will not contain that until 3 years after the ratification, but it will eventually put what you call the Bill of Rights in it. It's not really a Bill of Rights. It's further restraints on federal government. But it did eventually add that, but did not have it at the time when the document was being ratified, and that's why John. Okay, that's why. Okay, thanks, John. That's why George Mason did not sign it. We're now told that WFOV is back with us, and want to thank you for coming back after your 4-minute hiatus. We're always very glad you come back. And John just told me that they just came back from their break. So what we were saying here is just that the document is seamless. There are no gaps in between it, and there's no ambiguity in the Constitution. It's a very consistent document. And if we would learn to leave it alone, at least in the fundamental aspects of it, we'd be much better off. Don't start shaking that spider's web, because if you take one part of it, the fundamental parts of it, such as the changing of how we elect the senators in this country, and we elect them the same way we elect the members of the House when the responsibilities are different in the House and Senate, you have changed the document in a fundamental way, and we're paying a price for it right now, because part of the responsibility of the state's representatives, which would be the senators, was to go to Washington and check on the authority of the people in the federal government, because the state representatives, both the members of the House and the senators, were to be state representatives, not federal government representatives. They are in the federal government, but they were state representatives in the federal government. That was the intentions of the way you elect the members. They are elected inside the states, not across the states like it is for the President of the United States. You see how the document is refined, the thinking that went on in that room, and it's just really you have to be awestruck in how that document is laid out. And to change it like they did in 1913 and have the popular election of the senators was a big mistake. But if you're going to do that, well, let me say this: if you are going to do that, then be consistent. Because if you're going to have the senators elected the same way you have the members of the House elected, then you must then give them a 2-year term. To be consistent with the way in which you elect the members of the Senate, if you're going to do the same thing in their election you have for the members of the House, you must then give them the same amount of tenure in office. 2 years for the members of the House. If you're going to elect them by popular vote, then same thing in the Senate. But they didn't see the inconsistency of that action back there in 1913. Just leave the document alone, and let the document stand as those that were in that room as the minds of the country, still guiding this country 200 years later, as we're trying to hold on to the tenuousness of the republic, because it's been shattered in so many different ways. And most of it went on in that year, in 1913. I mean, the 16th Amendment was passed in that year. And this, you can see what problem we have with that. Direct taxation of the American people, never intended by the framers. And you can see how much this country's going out of control as a response to that direct taxation and taxing income in the country on the federal level. State level is one thing, but they have the taxation where the whole country is paying into a coffer. You can see that. You can see why that was not intended by the states, because you're there in the states and you can hold them accountable within each state, and you can also object to it by moving out of states and going elsewhere. But that's not true when you have the federal government doing it. And that's why it was forbidden to the federal government. If you're going to change one part of it, understand how it changes, and therefore what other changes are necessary because of that. Okay, so I made a mistake here. I thought that we welcomed WFOV back. John was informing me the WFOV was taking his break, so they're back now from the break. Okay, that's my mistake. I'm sorry. Sorry I made that mistake there. Okay, they're back from the break, and we're glad you're back. And we are still around the area where we were when you left, and so forth. Let me say a few things before we get into that part of what we're going to talk about today. I want to talk about what occurred this past week. We had a situation here where the president acted in his role as commander-in-chief. And I know a lot of his critics were going to take some exception to it, because whatever this president does is never going to be good enough, because the critics are going to find some fault with it. And really his action against this murderer, this man had the blood of 600 soldiers on his hand, probably more than that, but the body count by most persons is around 600 persons that were directly who have died directly as a result of this man's action. And so his brazen entry into Baghdad, he did not come directly from Iran. I thought that was interesting, but came into Baghdad by way of Damascus. But when he came in there at a time when the American embassy was under attack, he did not come in under disguise. And there's a reason for that, because he was aware that there was kind of like a hands-off in his case because of his prominence in the Iranian government, and they had their hands off of him, and he came in at the airport, and when they saw him come in there through their satellite, and saw him coming in at a time when the American embassy is under siege, they knew why he was there. He was not there coming into Iraq at that time to pick flowers. He's coming in there to coordinate the attack at the embassy, because this attack was pretty much at the umbrage of Iran. I know it's taking place in Iraq, but there are Iranian influences in Iraq. The Shia that are in Iraq. And Donald Trump, who has made it very clear that he is not going to sit over another Benghazi. That's not going to happen on Donald Trump's watch. In fact, that's not what we sent him there to do in terms of sitting over the continued decline of American power in the world. Although we have to be very, very clear about the exercise of that power, we are not here to sit over the decline of the United States in the world. And he brazenly went in there at a time when the embassy is under siege, and he got something he was not intending to get. And Donald Trump took it upon himself as a commander-in-chief to protect the embassy that was under attack in Baghdad, and sent a very clear message that this is not business as usual. And what really was interesting about it, if you look at what happened in the aftermath of that, is that people were now taking the side of the terrorists. You had CNN talking about what a statesman this guy was. Soleimani was a statesman all of a sudden. This man was a terrorist. This man had American blood on his hand, and they made him out to be a martyr in this country. This man is not.
It reminds me of, you ever hear the George Carlin get up about the lifestyle thing? You know, years ago, it was like people have a lifestyle. And he goes, you know, nowadays, you know, you can say that Genghis Khan had an active outdoor lifestyle. So, I mean, you could say, you could say he turned this guy around, and you could say he was a passionate patriot and a person involved in political involvement.
Right.
I mean, it just turned it around. They just sanitize it totally, you know?
Yeah, it was amazing. I hope persons were paying attention to how dangerous these people are in this country. We have an enemy within the borders of the United States, and they're talking about Donald Trump did not inform Congress before he took an action against a man that they're now applauding as some statesman in Iran. You're going to tell them about what you get ready to do?
Didn't Clinton bomb somebody like Libya or something like that because he was getting too much on about the Monica Lewinsky thing? He just came up and bombed Libya for a bit. No, did he announce that to Congress? That's my knowledge. I mean, the president does have a role to a certain point. It can't be sustained after a certain point without congressional approval, but they can do certain things within certain parameters.
They haven't called the question of the approval of war actions by this government since 1941, December the 8th, 1941, when Roosevelt, knowing that he'd get the approval to go to war after bombing of Pearl Harbor, which took place December the 7th, he went to the Congress the following day, knowing he's going to get it. I don't know if he would have gone there if he had thought that they would turn it down. But how are you going to turn it down when the country was under attack? So he went there December the 8th and asked for a declaration of war, which he got. And nobody's gone to Congress and asked for it since.
Actually, in my opinion, for what I've read of history, and I knew people who fought in the wars and were involved in that. Basically, if you ever heard of the American Volunteer Group? You ever heard of that organization?
No, I haven't heard of that.
American Volunteer Group was a bunch of U.S. pilots that was actually flying missions against Japan for China before we entered. It was about a year and a half, 2 years, even further before that. But they had military weaponry, not weaponry, but they had the planes from the U.S. Army Air Corps at that point. They were trained by U.S. trainers, but they were like disavowable by the U.S. government. They were set to, and they did several successful defensive things against Japan for on the behalf of the Chinese government at the time. And anyway, if you actually look at all the actions that FDR took with embargoes against Japan and other things he did, he stirred the pot to get a war going on. That's what I mean. There's no way anybody can really rationally deny that.
Cannot rationally, not based on the record. John Toler's book probably the best source for that, John, in terms of the instigation that was going on behind the scenes, the provocation that was taking place. And when they began to put that embargo that you talked about on Japan, that was an act of war. You're not a belligerent in the war at this point, and you are creating an embargo against Japan, and that colonial enclosure, that provocation has to be responded to, and they did respond to it by attacking Pearl Harbor, which, by the way, we had already decoded the encrypted messages of Japan, and we knew that they were getting ready to respond to it, and we did not, in fact, take the military precautions to prevent it, and then go and wave the red flag in front of the American people and get the auspices of the war being declared, which was intended through a backdoor approach by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that's well documented by John Toland's book.
No, see, the other thing is, too, I want to add here before we get somebody attacking us, the people who died in those initial attacks on Pearl were victims, okay, of their own government's manipulation and stuff. So they are, and that response that came, the visceral response that came from the United States citizen, the average person at that point, was genuine. They had no knowledge of what FDR's administration had done.
That's right.
Or the very little knowledge.
They were laid out there sitting ducks. And don't ever think that these people who think they're morally bound, morally above others, that they take it upon themselves to decide what the greatest good is, and they'll sacrifice down here at this level, with the claim being that above that level there is a higher moral calling, and that's what they did in this case. That the sacrificial aspects of those persons that were killed at Pearl Harbor, it was a sacrifice for the greater good. That they had to stop Hirohito and Tojo, had to stop Hitler in Europe, and the way they did that was, in fact, to pull back the defense and allow what they knew was getting ready to happen, and they allowed it to go forward. And this is not something you see just on one occasion. You see this repeatedly taking place, where they make a decision that there's something above doing the right thing, in this case right here, because it's a higher moral calling or something else that they're trying to achieve that goes above this particular element in which they are sacrificing this party right here. You saw that. I'll tell you, you saw that with Carter Page. I don't think Carter Page is innocent. They sent Carter Page in there as a spy into Donald Trump's headquarters, and then they used his placement in that headquarters to go and get the FISA court to give them the surveillance of the Trump campaign, because they said that there was some contact inside of the campaign with the Russians. Of course it was. The double agent that was in there, Carter Page, was FBI, and he had a responsibility of gathering intelligence on the Russians. Therefore, his role was contact with Russia, but they used the contact inside of the Trump campaign and claimed that was a contact that the Trump campaign had. It wasn't the Trump campaign, it was Carter Page, the FBI agent, who was sitting in there. And then after they made some use of him, they threw him away and began to charge him with collusion with the Russians. So this is not a one-time deal that occurred on December the 7th. They rationalize this by saying that there's a higher calling, and therefore this immorality, which you can say that's not moral, to sacrifice anybody's life and claim that can be rationalized, but they do it all the time, and they did it in Carter Page's case. And you see it also in part of what they did back in that time period in 1941. They knew that it was coming. Japan had no other choice in the matter. And they struck out trying to do what? What's the attack in Pearl Harbor about? Trying to relinquish the influence in the South Pacific that was strangling the economy, and they were striking out against that stranglehold. They were working from their national interests, and Roosevelt was working from the national interests of the United States. But don't forget here, people died as a result of how you saw that national interest. And it played out in a way in which some people's lives were in fact sacrificed. That's well documented. And as I said earlier, John Toller's book is probably the best source of that. The Land of the Rising Sun, which he wrote. Brilliant book. And it documents it very well about them having gotten the encryption. They had broken the code, and they were able to read what they were saying inside of their encrypted messages, and they allowed it to go forward. In fact, you may know the other part of the story. The one when they had sent a delegation over here from Japan that was in the White House at the time of the bombing. And the president had not allowed them to come into the Oval Office at that point, because he was in fact talking to Joe Louis. And Joe Louis would be playing a role in the war by boxing and doing exhibitions and things that sort of raising money, all of that. Not that they forgave him for those purses that he made. He was donating the purses, but there's a taxation that's attached to it. And although he's donating the purses, he will be later on thrown to the wolves himself, because he's now in financial straits, because he's that money is being taxed. He doesn't he doesn't hold out the taxation aspect, and that's his income. And so his raising that money puts him in jeopardy later on, and that's why Joe Louis never got out of debt and died in debt, never could have paid it off. But that's just that's how they operate. But that don't think that's anything exceptional, and we have to get back to what Benjamin Franklin was worried about: a republic if you can keep it, and we can't keep it if we don't understand how the republic was in fact constructed, because there is a construction here. And if you start changing it, understand the implications of the change, and then change the other aspects of it so that it's been consistently being changed inside the document. You can't leave senators in there for 6 years and you are elected in the same way as you elected the members of the House of Representatives, and they are no longer representatives of the states. The senators don't represent the states anymore. They're not elected by the state legislatures as it was before 1913, before the passage of the 17th Amendment. And they changed that part in the 17th Amendment, but did not change the other part of it, because you see, they're not these people in the Congress at that time as they were at that convention where they thought these things out. And by the way, did you notice that the senators have a tenure in their electoral offices that's longer than the president? The president served only 4 years. The senators were assigned to serve 6 years. And that should tell you something. 6 years, well, let's go up the ladder of the amount of tenure of the office holders. 2 years for the members of the House, 4 years for the president, but 6 years for the senators. And why would that be the case? Because the president is the CEO of the entire country. So why in the world would the senators have a tenure that's 2 years longer than the tenure of the president? And the answer is, the senators are the representatives of the states, and the states are the creators of the federal government, and they are overseeing the federal government, and that's why their importance is established in their tenure over the tenure of the President of the United States. So you're not going to be able to go into a room with the people on this intellectual level today and clarify anything in that document. You can't do it. And it has not been done. Every time that they have put anything in there, I'm not saying all of the amendments should never been added, but everything they've done in order to try to change it, to refine it, to make it better, has been hurtful of the document. And a lot of it is why we're out of control right now in Washington, because they've changed in some fundamental ways never intended by the framers. And I said this last week. I don't think that you can add an amendment to the document that by it being added to the document, it changes the fundamentals of the document. I don't think that you can do that. It can be amended, but not amended to the point where the fundamentals of the document goes out of control, because you cannot amend the Constitution that governs the country, so it stops doing that. And I like to have some constitutional discussions about that. We haven't had anybody discussing it because they don't understand it. These people don't understand the Constitution. These people like Alan Dershowitz, they can claim they're scholars. I don't see any evidence of it. I don't see any evidence of it, not when you talk about the impeachment process and things of that sort. Okay, I'll come back to that. Let me say the president has sent a strong message. This is a very strong president. I have a lot of admiration for President Trump, because I think he really does have a sincere love for this country. And I don't think there are very many persons in Washington really have that. And if it is, it's certainly not apparent. You don't see a lot of evidence of it in terms of how they're carrying out their responsibilities in the House or the Senate. And a lot of persons in those two bodies, let's be honest here, if you really want to hold them to account, a lot of the people in that governing body are guilty of sedition in this country. And I use the word sedition because I don't want to use the word treason, but it amounts to that. They are undermining the integrity of this country. You saw it come out of the woodwork last week. That's one thing that Donald Trump's election has done for this country. A lot of the persons that were in the background working against this country, giving money, they call it foreign aid. Well, the foreign aid doesn't stay foreign if it comes back here and it gets in people's pockets. Like in Biden's son's case, when they gave him, they say $50,000 a month. Really, that was about $186,000 a month. But there were two persons that were siphoning off that amount of money. And why would it go to Biden's son? Because the law says that office holders in the federal government cannot enrich themselves by these kinds of deals. So what have they done here? They put it in the family and let it go. There's no prohibition against that. And that's why Hunter Biden was getting the check. Because they found a way to get around. You see, the law, you can violate the law by violating the spirit of the law, not the law itself, but the spirit of the law is being violated, and that's a violation on the part of Joe Biden. This man ran for president. Not that he's going to get anywhere close to it, because if he does get out of the primary, and that's not even a given, we don't know who's going to get it. None of them are running strong campaigns. And I don't know if Bloomberg's money is going to be the cutting edge or not. He seems to be moving up the scale. He's now number 3. He's only been in there a couple of weeks, and he's already the third one in terms of the poll because of the amount of money he's spending. I think he's already spent about $200 million on his campaign. And so you're saying he's moving up there. I don't know if he'll get the nomination or not, but he's not doing badly, given he just threw his hat in the ring. And don't count out Hillary Clinton, because none of them are standing out. None of them are really that strong. And making all these outlandish comments, I don't know. They're still trying to find somebody that can go against Donald Trump. And there's nobody over there, quite frankly, Bloomberg included. He might have the money. He doesn't have the personality. He doesn't have the charisma and the presence that this man has, because when Donald Trump comes in there, Donald Trump fills the room up. And that man, he just has something that is very rare. And there's only one Donald Trump in the country, and only one Donald Trump, quite frankly, on the planet. There's nobody else in the political arena in any country in the world like this man. And that's a fact. You may not want to give him credit, but that's a fact. There's no one else like this man in power right now. And that's why they are all taking this man's notes. And he's having a lot of influence out there, quite frankly, because the populist movements in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, in Iraq and Iran, they're not all burning the American flag. Some of them are laudatory of the president. And some people in Iran, by the way, are saying they want to thank Donald Trump. I don't know if y'all got that story or not through CNN or MSNBC, DNC, or not. But that's a story is not being told. A lot of people in Iran that understand that he's giving them some cover for their objection to the Iranian state about what he's doing. And Donald Trump took out a person that is many considered to be the second most powerful person in Iran, next to Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran. Many people say that Soleimani was the second most powerful person in Iran, and that went right into the government of Iran without even attacking Iran on their soil. But the message was very clear. This idea, the message that Donald Trump sent, is a very important message. And that message is this: by just what happened to Soleimani in Baghdad. He didn't attack Iran, but the fact that he attacked a person inside of the Iranian government sent a message that no longer are the surrogates, as you pass this war off into your surrogates in other parts of the world while Iran stands intact. The message is that that day is over. Wow, we ran out of time again here. Donald Trump sent a strong message here. Don't let this noise fool you. And he said to the mullahs in Iran that this is not a warning, it's a threat. And everybody's talking about what they're going to do. They're going to do this, and then they're going to do that. Let me tell you something. They're not going to do anything, because they understand what that means. And Donald Trump is not going to allow them to hit the United States anywhere and they get away with it in Iran. Tehran is on the map, and they've already identified 52 targets. This is an unusual president. This is the commander-in-chief of the United States, and you got the wrong one. Okay, I come here every week to talk about something else, and I get on these topics and we don't get around to it, but I guarantee you, I'm writing it down right now, and next week we are going to talk about the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sitting there in the Senate as this goes to trial. It will be going to trial at some point in the near future. Okay, want you to, as always, follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.